Okay, so get this. We've got some sources today talking about a potential economic blackout.
Mm-hmm.
And it's happening like right now,
Wow.
February 28th, 2025.
As we speak.
Yeah, so we're talking about a grassroots movement called the People's Union USA, and they're calling for a full 24-hour nationwide boycott of major corporations.
Interesting.
It seems like Wisconsin is like a focal point for all of this.
Yeah, that's a fascinating choice, isn't it? Wisconsin has a really, really strong history when it comes to labor movements and activism.
Right.
So it's not just some random location they picked,
Yeah.
There's definitely some historical context there that adds a whole other layer to what's going on.
Yeah, for sure. It's like they're trying to channel that energy from the past.
Yeah.
But I've got to ask, do you really think boycotting these huge corporations,
Mhm.
even for a whole day, is going to make an actual difference? I mean, these companies are making trillions of dollars.
Yeah, well, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Some experts I've seen think this is mostly symbolic,
Yeah.
A way to grab attention, get people talking about these issues.
Yeah.
But there are others that are much more skeptical that this will actually hurt these giant corporations financially.
So who exactly is behind this economic blackout?
Well, the sources are all pointing to a guy named John Schwartz,
Okay.
and his organization is called the People's Union USA.
Oh,
They're saying they're nonpartisan,
okay.
and their goals seem to be things like fair wages for workers, pushing for companies to be more eco-friendly, and limiting how much influence these corporations have in politics.
Okay, I see why these goals are important, but why now? What's the urgency behind all of this?
Well, just think about it. We're seeing these record corporate profits, while at the same time, real wages are just staying the same.
Right.
Climate change is getting worse and worse,
Uh-huh.
and you see corporations spending millions lobbying against anything that would, help the environment, regulations and things.
Yeah.
People are starting to feel like the system just isn't working for them. And this boycott is a way to push back and try to take back some of that power.
So hitting them where it hurts
Yeah,
profits in their public image.
exactly.
But how are they actually planning to get people to participate in this? Is it really as simple as just not shopping for a day?
Well, it's a bit more organized than that.
Okay.
It's kind of a three-pronged approach.
Okay.
First, they're asking people to avoid shopping at any of those big box stores.
Okay.
Places like Walmart,
Right.
Target,
Mhm.
Amazon, you name it.
Got it.
Then second, they're really urging people to skip any spending that isn't absolutely necessary for the entire day.
Okay.
So that's things like gas, fast food, that sort of thing.
Makes sense.
It's all about just making a very conscious choice to change those spending habits.
Even for just 24 hours.
Yeah.
So what's the third part?
So the third part of the plan is to support your local businesses.
Okay.
And they're asking people to use cash specifically.
Mm.
The idea is to keep the money circulating within the actual community and completely cut out those big corporations.
So I remember reading a study that showed something like 60% of every dollar that you spend at a local business stays in the community,
Wow.
compared to only 14% at a big chain store.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that could actually have a significant impact.
Exactly. And this isn't some brand new idea.
Right.
Boycotts have a long and actually pretty fascinating history when it comes to activism.
Yeah.
One example that immediately comes to mind is the Montgomery bus boycott back during the Civil Rights Movement,
Rare.
which lasted for over a year.
Wow.
And it was extremely effective in bringing about some really important social change.
Right.
Of course, not all boycotts are successful,
Right.
but history shows us that when people get together and use their buying power, they can actually create a lot of force for change.
So this economic blackout is kind of tapping into that historical power.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
They're using that legacy of activism
Right.
and a method that's been proven to work to try and shift the balance of power a little bit.
Now, whether this particular boycott will work as well as some of those historical examples is debatable.
Yeah.
But the organizers seem to be pretty determined.
For sure.
In fact, they're already talking about what they're going to do after February 28th to escalate things.
Really?
Yeah.
What are they planning?
So the sources are mentioning more targeted boycotts,
Okay.
like weeks long,
Oh, wow.
targeting specific companies like Amazon and Nestle.
Wow.
Yeah, it seems like this 24-hour blackout is only the first step in a much bigger and longer-term strategy.
Okay, so even if this initial impact is debatable, they're already thinking about the long game and planning to go after specific companies with boycotts that could last for weeks. Amazon and Nestlé are two that are already on their list.
So this initial 24-hour blackout is like just the beginning. It seems like they're really trying to build up some momentum and keep the pressure on these companies. But before we get too far into that, I'm still curious about why they chose Wisconsin. You mentioned its labor history, but could you maybe tell us a bit more about that? What makes it such a symbolic location for this kind of action?
Well, one thing to remember is that Wisconsin was a really important place during the fight for workers' rights in the early 1900s.
Uh-huh.
It was a time when working conditions were just awful.
Yeah.
People were fighting for very basic things like having an 8-hour workday and the right to even form a union.
Right.
And Wisconsin was like right at the front of that movement.
Mm.
They passed some of the very first laws in the country to protect workers.
So it's got this like really deep connection to the struggle for workers' rights.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that activism continued throughout the 20th century and even into the 21st.
Yeah.
Remember those huge protests back in 2011 against the anti-union legislation?
Yeah.
Wisconsin was once again this major focal point for the entire national debate about workers' rights and the power of collective action. So it makes a lot of sense that the People's Union USA would choose Wisconsin as a powerful symbol for their nationwide boycott.
It's like they're trying to tap into that fighting spirit and that legacy of standing up for what you believe in.
Exactly.
But okay, let's get back to the boycott itself. Even if it does succeed in making a statement, will it actually lead to any real change?
Right.
These companies are enormous. They're not just going to crumble because people skip their morning Starbucks for a day, right?
Yeah, you're right to be skeptical.
Hmm.
One day of slightly lower profits probably isn't going to make these corporations completely change all their policies. And to be fair to the other side, some economists actually think that boycotts can backfire.
How so?
Well, the idea is that if you hurt a company's profits too much, they might end up having to lay off workers.
Right.
And then that could actually make things worse for some people.
So it's not as simple as just like hitting them in the wallet and expecting them to change their ways overnight.
Exactly.
There are all sorts of complicated economic and social factors to consider.
For sure.
But what about the argument that these boycotts are more about raising awareness and changing public opinion and building momentum for change in the long run? Is there any evidence that those sorts of impacts are actually possible?
Oh, absolutely. Think about the movement to get companies to source products like coffee or chocolate ethically.
Right.
Those movements started out really small,
Mm-hmm.
with just consumers demanding more transparency and fairness in the supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
Over time, these movements gained a lot of traction, influenced public opinion, and eventually companies were forced to change how they did things.
Okay.
It wasn't always easy, and it definitely didn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
But it shows that if consumers put enough pressure on companies, it can lead to actual lasting change.
So it's less about the immediate impact and more about the ripple effects over time. It's about planting a seed and maybe even starting a movement.
Exactly. And this economic blackout could be a part of that bigger shift in how people think about being a consumer.
Oh, okay.
It's a reminder that we have choices,
Mm-hmm.
and those choices can actually make a difference.
That brings us to the bigger picture here. This isn't just some isolated event. It seems like it's part of a growing trend, right? More and more people are becoming aware of just how much power these corporations have, and they're starting to look for ways to fight back.
Yeah, exactly. Over the past few years, we've seen this big increase in what people are calling conscious consumerism.
Right.
People are starting to really think more critically about where their money is going, and they're demanding more from the companies that they support. They want things like transparency, ethical practices, and they want companies to have values that actually match their own.
It's like people are waking up to the fact that they're not just shoppers. They can use their money to actually vote for the kind of world they want to live in.
Right. And that's a really powerful idea. It's about realizing that every purchase you make is a choice, and all those choices together can actually make a real difference. And it's not just about individual products or specific brands. This economic blackout is taking that idea of conscious consumerism and like bringing it to this whole other level. It's really about trying to use our collective power as consumers to send the message to all these corporations
Yeah.
to say, we're not happy with how things are and we want to see some real change.
It's like holding up a mirror to them and saying, well, this is the impact you're having. Are these really the values you want to stand for? But I do have to wonder how they're going to actually react to this kind of pressure. I mean, they're not really known for being open to criticism, are they?
True. They might just get defensive and become even more resistant to change.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, maybe this will be a wake-up call for them.
Right.
A moment where they finally realize that they can't just ignore all these people who are demanding more ethical and sustainable practices.
It seems like they're kind of at a crossroads here. Do they just stick with the whole profit at all costs model? Or do they actually start thinking about their role in society, their impact on the environment, and their responsibility to the communities where they do business?
And it's not just about companies changing their internal policies. This movement is also about raising awareness among all consumers, giving them the information they need to make better choices, and ultimately trying to shift the entire marketplace towards a more sustainable and equitable future.
So it's not just about this one day of boycotting. It's about creating a lasting change in how people actually behave as consumers, right?
Exactly. And that's where things get really exciting.
Yeah.
Because if enough people start to demand change, if they start voting with their wallets, it creates this ripple effect that forces companies to adapt and become more responsive to the needs and values of their customers.
It's kind of like a feedback loop, right? The more consumers demand change, the more companies are pushed to change, which then empowers consumers to demand even more.
Yeah.
But the big question here is, will this economic blackout actually be the thing that kicks off that kind of shift?
Well, that's something we'll just have to wait and see. It's definitely an experiment, a really bold move by this grassroots movement to try to shift the balance of power. But no matter what happens, it's definitely starting a conversation that we need to be having. A conversation about what role corporations should have in our society, how powerful consumer activism can be, and what kind of future we really want to create.
And in the end, it all comes back to us as individuals. What kind of impact do we want to have with our spending? Are we willing to make some sacrifices to support businesses that share our values, even if it costs a bit more or takes a bit more effort? These are the questions that this economic blackout is making us think about.
Because ultimately, we're not just watching this economic system from the sidelines.
Yeah.
We have a voice.
Yeah.
We have power, and we can choose to use that power to create a world that is more just and more sustainable.
So what does this all mean for you? We've talked about the history, the motivations, the potential impacts, but now it's your turn to decide. What do you think? Can this kind of collective action actually make a real difference? And what role do you want to play in this evolving story?
Yeah, take some time to really think about what we've talked about today. Do your own research, and most importantly, think about the power that you have as a consumer.
Because every choice we make, every dollar we spend is a vote for the kind of world we want to live in.
And with that, we'll leave you to think about those questions.
This has been quite the deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.